History Bites Back, Confronting the Atomic Leviathan in Jaws. Part 3. As various critics have noted in their biographical pieces on the director, Spielberg's filmmaking has often revolved around the topic of the Second World War, a war which his own father, Arnold, served in, and who, as Stephen recalls, filled my head with war stories when I was growing up. For example, the Second World War forms the background context, or is at least an important reference point in various Spielberg films, including 1941, Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, Empire of the Sun, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Schindler's List, and Saving Private Ryan. Incidentally, Jaws continues this trend via the widely acclaimed Indianapolis scene, when the shark hunter Quint delivers a chilling first-hand recollection of his experience aboard the USS Indianapolis during the Second World War. As Quint tells it, after transporting components of the atomic bomb to the United States Air Base at Tinian Island, the USS Indianapolis was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine en route to the island of Leyte, leaving Quint and his fellow surviving crew members to fend for themselves in shark-infested waters. Interestingly, and unbeknown to contemporary audience members, myself included, the speech was actually based upon the real-life sinking of the USS Indianapolis that actually occurred a month later than the movie's specified date of June 29, 1945. Consequently, the Indianapolis speech, which wasn't actually included in Benchley's original novel, therefore adds a significant historical context to the events unfolding within Jaws, along with providing audiences with the crucial missing piece as to understanding Quint's career obsession with hunting and killing sharks. Such an interpretation is, however, formulated around the simple assumption that screenwriter Howard Sackler simply chose the Indianapolis disaster because it just so conveniently happened to be the worst American wartime catastrophe at sea involving sharks. Doing so dismisses the prospect of there being any further purpose and meaning inherent in the inclusion of Quint's Indianapolis speech within Jaws, other than to simply provide logic and reason behind his character. One must look deeper beneath the surface. Therefore, let us take into consideration two contextual factors which provide a much more expansive analytical foundation with which to facilitate what I perceive as a much more significant meaning and purpose behind Quint's speech. The first relates to that of understanding Hiroshima's intrinsic link to feelings of guilt, shame, and responsibility within America's national consciousness around the time of Jaws' release, which coincided with the 30th anniversary of the atomic bombings. Now, as noted earlier, Hiroshima remained largely on the periphery of the national consciousness until the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations of the late 60s and early 70s shifted the critical focus upon the bomb's usage once again. But in what meaningful way did the memorialization of Hiroshima come to reflect and refract America's conception of itself and its citizens? On the most elemental level, Hiroshima's memorialization exemplified the precipitous decline in the faith that Americans traditionally placed in their nation, institutions, and leaders post-Watergate in Vietnam, and therefore begs the question, was the bombing necessary? Now, such a question reflected both a growing national guilt for Hiroshima and a developing societal paranoia that America had now become susceptible to nuclear retribution from its Cold War adversaries, such as the Soviet Union. As William Shannon lamented, "Our feelings of guilt are now tinctured with dread. We have come to realize that we cannot keep the terrifying secret for ourselves alone, that others possess it, and that mortal enemies work night and day to refine nuclear weapons for possible use. Our dread is that Hiroshima's fate may become our own." Now, the second regards the authors of the Indianapolis speech. As explained by Spielberg and screenwriter Kyle Gottlieb in countless Jaws-related interviews and documentaries, Howard Sackler's initial draft was passed on to John Milius, a screenwriter whose passion for military history frequently intertwined with his controversial political views, which, as he admits, are from the other side, and Hollywood always veers left. Milius's version of Sackler's version then found itself in the capable hands of Robert Shaw, an actor who had developed a reputation pre-Jaws as an astute playwright via his critical exploration of how issues of morality, social responsibility, and identity influenced cultural memory of the Holocaust in his 1967 novel The Man in the Glass Booth, which critics praised for daring to ask whether or not the Germans should ever be absolved for the killing of the Jews. Now, regardless of Sackler's intentions, the fact that the Sharks attacked the crew responsible for delivering the atomic bomb is significant in that it posits a direct causal chain of events relevant to the post-revisionist atomic debates being played out off-camera around the time of Jaws' production and release, namely that the crew of the Indianapolis were preyed upon by the Sharks in retribution for their role in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. In doing so, Quint's speech contradicts Matt Hooper's earlier stereotyping of the shark as a mere mindless eating machine that does little else other than swim and eat and make little sharks, by imbuing its predatory demeanor with a certain retributive agency that transforms it into a sophisticated avatar of moral judgment upon the crew of the Indianapolis. In this context, the monster great white shark terrorizing Amity 30 years later in Jaws can therefore be interpreted as embodying the moral retribution of Hiroshima, which preyed upon America's national consciousness around the mid-1970s. Jaws thus slots neatly into the revenge of nature category, so common within post-1960s Hollywood monster movies, what David Russell refers to as deviant nature. Andrew Tudor has also categorized the monster movie genre, deciphering the eco-threat movies of the 1970s and 1980s as an ongoing set of dichotomous alternatives, each pairing a broad tendency within the genre, not an exclusive option. They could be from the supernatural to the secular, the external to the internal, and the autonomous to the dependent. For example, all of Spielberg's monster movies, Jaws, Jurassic Park: The Lost World, Jurassic Park and The War of the Worlds, can be allotted within the autonomous dependent category, where the threatening force is quite simply there, quite independent of humanity, though posing a threat to it. Or alternatively, the creatures remain dependent on human volition, and the threat they pose stands in significant contrast to that presented by more autonomous monsters. For example, the invading aliens from War of the Worlds would fall into the realm of the autonomous, the rampaging dinosaurs in Jurassic Park and The Lost World into the dependent, and the sinister truck and Jewel somewhere in between. Now, the crucial question, posited here by both Russell and Tudor in relation to Jaws, is the assigning of personal and societal accountability. Are we responsible for creating the threatening situation, or does it emerge quite independently of our intentions and action? For example, the aliens in War of the Worlds and the truck and Jewel arrive mostly independent of human action, whilst in the Jurassic Park films, human intervention is responsible for creating the dinosaurs. In Jaws, the implication is that human action is responsible for the threatening situation posed by the shark, namely the bombing of Hiroshima by the Truman administration during the Second World War. However, the only individual residing within Amity who bears any sort of link to this specific historical event is Quint, the USS Indianapolis survivor, who throughout various scenes is shown with blood in his hands, itself a symbolic metaphor for the atomic guilt he articulates via his service aboard the Indianapolis, and which he himself has attempted to suppress by erasing a tattoo of the ship from his arm. However, not only is Quint's attempt to suppress his guilt portrayed as being unsuccessful, since Brody observes the tattoo scar on his forearm, but also futile, as evidenced during the final climatic fight, when Brody desperately attempts to grasp Quint's outstretched hand, but is helpless to prevent his agonizing slide into the gaping maw of the shark, which, in a supernatural flexing of its unstoppable resolve, has smashed through the orca's transom by propelling itself out of the water. Now, while some critics may interpret this sequence as Spielberg's visual acknowledgement that Americans must learn to literally and figuratively let go of their atomic guilts and insecurities, I'm certainly more inclined, given Jaws' release amidst the national despair and frustration over the twin debacles of Watergate and Vietnam, to interpret Quint's demise as Spielberg's reaffirmation of American national pride, strength and purpose, which dwindled under the presidency of Gerald Ford, declined further under Jimmy Carter, and was later revitalized by Ronald Reagan. The erasure of Quint, a figurative symbol of America's murky atomic past, clears the path for Chief Brody, the film's standalone figure of credible moral authority in contrast to the unscrupulous Mayor Vaughn, to triumphantly blow the shark into smithereens and send the atomic retribution it embodies sinking into the abyss, thereby neatly complementing the theme of American liberation being celebrated during the film's 4th of July background setting. Given that this moment occurred in the midst of national despair and frustration over Watergate and Vietnam, one understands why audiences responded so fervently to Brody's triumph over the shark. For Andrew Britton, it is at this point that Jaws becomes a communal exorcism, a ceremony for the restoration of ideological confidence. The film is inconceivable without an enormous audience, without the exhilarating, jubilant explosion of cheers and hosannas which greet the annihilation of the shark, and which transforms the cinema momentarily into a temple. However, given the later revamping of Cold War tensions between the two superpowers following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan a few years later in 1979, this interpretation that Brody's annihilation of the shark miraculously obliterated audience atomic fears and insecurities in this case ultimately falls short. Nevertheless, it gives us an important insight into understanding how Jaws' overall cultural significance and appeal at the time derived partly from its simultaneous ability to both articulate and allay social fears and anxieties that a decadent America had become an increasingly vulnerable and deserving prey for nuclear retribution by the mid-1970s. Indeed, for Dan Ruby, this dual nature is precisely what made Jaws so appealing to moviegoers. The popularity of a film like Jaws means that the film articulates the current concerns, fears, and desires of the people who see it and recommend it to their friends, Ruby writes. Furthermore, Jaws remains one of the most significant films ever made about the USS Indianapolis disaster in Hollywood cinema history. Watching the film has become a symbolic rite of passage which thrusts this lesser-known naval disaster into the public consciousness, evidenced in the dedication of the USS Indianapolis Memorial in 1995, the establishment of the USS Indianapolis Museum in 2007, and the successful crusade of 12-year-old Hunter Scott to ensure a congressional investigation and exoneration of the ship's captain, Charles B. McVeigh III, who was controversially held accountable for the loss of the Indianapolis by a US Navy court-martial. Moreover, the film posits an intriguing yet uncomfortably reflexive question regarding Hiroshima itself. If, as Stimson claims, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima was morally justifiable on the basis that it saved lives, then does not the deaths of the Indianapolis crew responsible for transporting the atomic bomb render this justificatory argument void? Riding the waves of the post-revisionist enterprise of the 1970s, Jaws propagates its own significant cine-revision of the official Hiroshima narrative by foregrounding both the psychological and physical suffering endured by the crew of the Indianapolis at the expense of delivering the atomic bomb. Doing so raises important introspective questions and debates about America's atomic legacy that inspires greater critical reflection of American wartime bureaucracy and the bomb's victimization not only of the Japanese but Americans themselves. For Spielberg, the 1940s era remains a complex period of innocence and tremendous jeopardy, and he would continue to faithfully revisit this decade throughout his distinguished career, from Jaws to Empire of the Sun to Saving Private Ryan. Indeed, each of these films represent a distinct approach to its subject matter that mirrors conditions in the Hollywood film industry and the nation at large. Empire of the Sun demonstrates the greater respect for American military forces provided by Reaganite conservatism. Saving Private Ryan mirrors a 1990s America striving for post-Cold War stability by paying homage to the brave sacrifices of American soldiers. And Jaws encapsulates the confidence crisis of 1970s America by questioning the immoral sacrifice of American servicemen abroad. In doing so, the film serves as one of the many significant cultural landmarks where important issues of national identity, morality, and historical representation are negotiated. The fact that Spielberg failed to receive a nomination for Best Director at the 47th Annual Academy Awards remains arguably controversial, given his pivotal role as universal humanitarian and liberator during a period of grave national crisis and uncertainty.